Good afternoon and welcome to this online conversation. We're so glad that you have joined us today. This is the fourth conversation in a summer webinar series that we're calling Everyday Faith, Possibilities, Limits, and Callings. My name is Noel Snyder. I'm a program manager at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And it's my great pleasure to have with me as my conversation partner today, Tish Harrison Warren. Tish is a priest in the Anglican Church in North America. For many years, she served with InterVarsity, and more recently, she has served in pastoral ministry, local church settings. And she has published widely in outlets such as The Well, Christianity Today, Comment Magazine, Christ in Pop Culture, and Art House America. She's the author of a couple of magnificent books, at least I think that they're magnificent. Her first one, Liturgy of the Ordinary, was selected as Christianity Today's 2018 Book of the Year. So I'm not the only one who thought that that was a magnificent book. And now she has out a new book, which our conversation will focus on today. The book is called Prayer in the Night for Those Who Work or Watch or Weep. And it's published this year, 2021, by InterVarsity Press. It's a poignant and a beautiful reflection on suffering and grief and the practices of faith that form us and sustain us through dark times. Tish, I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to reflect together on your work. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the Calvin Institute for Worship. I'm very grateful for it.
Oh, great. I can't believe that we've really never had you as one of our panelists or participants, unless there's something that I'm not realizing that we've done with you before.
I don't remember, to be honest. I don't know.
Well, I'm glad that we've
arrived.
Yes, we have arrived. We've finally made the connection now. So, well, if we could just start by talking about the book in general. It's so beautiful. I mean, at least that's my own reading of it. I know I'm not alone in that. And what's interesting to me is that in God's providence, it's a very timely book with the pandemic that has swept over the whole globe and thrust us all into this situation of suffering and suffering together in many ways. So I wonder if you could talk with us about where the book comes from. I know that your writing of it started well before the pandemic, but so if you could just share with us how you got the idea and what were some of the goals that you had in writing it.
Yeah. In fact, I wrote most of this in 2018 and 2019. It was really finished, like when at the very, very tail end, when you're arguing with editors about, prepositions at that point. It's the putting the final touches on that COVID hit, which was difficult to figure out what to do for my editor and myself. Just that it was a book about it's a book about suffering and theodicy and where is God in the midst of pain. And then we were closing it right as this giant shockwave hit the world. And so it was very relevant, but knowing, do we stop? Do we address COVID? How do we respond to that? It took a lot of thought and prayer and decisions on our part and particularly kind of on my part, figuring out how to proceed with it. But so the timing is weird. I mean, it was unpredictable, but this came really, so this wasn't a response to COVID, though it came out after that. It was a response to my own life and mostly, and kind of focuses a lot on the year 2017 in my family when we moved across the country from Austin, where we live now and where I'm from, to Pittsburgh, which is, so it was like there's a physical darkness, a cloudy, Pittsburgh is the most cloudy city in America. It's a wonderful city, I have to say. We really love it. But there is a darkness to the winters there that informs this book in talking about darkness. But then there was also, it was just a time, a kind of a dark night of the soul for me, that we moved, and a week later, my father back here in Texas passed away suddenly. And then we had an unexpected pregnancy, which was very joyful, and that ended in miscarriage a month later. And then they got pregnant again, had a long, difficult pregnancy where I had to be on restricted activity, like bed rest, for a while. And we lost that baby in July of that year. So that was, we lost, and it was a son. So it was about 6 months of moving, losing a parent, miscarrying, things that are actually fairly common struggles. This isn't a book about catastrophic or unheard of suffering. This was, in many ways, a lot of us face loneliness and moves. We face loss of a parent. All of us will, if we live long enough. Miscarriages are very common. So, but what I've discovered in that is, first of all, it being common doesn't lessen the pain of walking through it yourself. But beyond that, I was just tired. I was spiritually kind of worn out, and it brought up questions for me of when my faith feels really fraught and really uncertain, and when I'm struggling with grief and loss and doubt and wondering where God is in the midst of this, and have prayed prayers for healing for this child that didn't happen, that our son died anyway. And in the midst of that, how do I what does it even mean to be honest, to be 100% honest about where I'm at, and to walk in the way of Jesus in a way that's true, and that's authentic, and that's faithful, and that's real. And so I really found myself falling back onto the prayers and practices of the church in ways that, even when my faith felt really thin or really ambiguous, that I could continue to sort of take up these practices that called me beyond myself and into something greater than kind of the ardor that I could conjure up that day. And so the book sort of begins there on I start in I think it's the first chapter, one of them, where I say I was a priest that couldn't pray because prayer felt really difficult for me. And so in that space, what do you do? How do you continue? And that's kind of where the book begins.
Mm-hmm. So I was reading the book, and I kept asking myself in many ways, just like, what type of book is this? Is it about theology? Is it about worship, prayer, ministry, spirituality? Is it a memoir? And even from what you've just described, I think it in such a great way is kind of like all of those put together. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I love about what you've done with the book. And I'm just wondering how you would describe the genre or the topic of the book.
Yes, genre conversations are very difficult for me because I'm not sure. I mean, in the most general sense, this would be considered like spiritual writing. But so I think good spiritual writing needs to be theologically very rich. And in fact, I would argue this is a weakness in a lot of Christian books or evangelical books. No, I'm going to say more generally than just evangelical books, but Christian books in general, is that I feel like there are places where the writing is so lovely and the theology is really pretty thin soup, or vice versa. The theology is really rich, but I'm like, oh no, this is written so as to be difficult to understand, it feels like. And so So I try, so in that sense, I want my book to be theological, but it's not a systematic theology. I want there to be kind of a lot of background reading and a lot of knowledge that doesn't make it necessarily into the sentences, but informs what the sentences say, if that makes sense. So it's not explicit, but it's implicit. And then, but of course, like, I think good spiritual writing touches on human experience and our own experience. And so it brings in elements of memoir, and certainly brings in, there's sort of the whole like Christian life genre that I resist and don't love. But what they're trying to get at there is the practicality of faith, which is really what interests me and draws me, is the questions of how do doctrine and practice go together? How are they necessary together? How do they inform one another? How do they work against one another or bolster one another or contradict one another? And so I'm interested in those questions, but I don't have a great answer about my own genre. I mean, I read a lot of theology, and I read a lot of poetry, and I read a lot of like Annie Dillard, who does kind of lyrical nonfiction. And I hope that sort of all kind of informs what I'm doing, but what I'm doing isn't any one of those things. It's kind of, if it's taking all the things I like and trying to put it in a pot and stir it around and see like what new concoction is formed, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm grateful for your insistence on being sort of a genre buster in that way.
I mean, ultimately, I think I do feel like I'm trying to do the work somewhat of a translator, where I'm taking academic kind of theology and putting it in a way that can resonate with people in the pews. But I hope it's even more than that, right? Because I would also like the writing to be like a pleasure to read. So like lovely, which a lot of Christian books. So I'm not saying that I have achieved any of this. I'm not, that's up to the reader to decide, but those are some of my hopes. I pray before I write, I pray from the Psalms to send out your light and your truth and let them lead me. And so truth is a sort of theological robustness. Light is beauty, is glory. And I'm hoping both of those end up somewhat, even a very pale version of it in the book itself. So.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I appreciate that. So I want to build on a little bit of something that you said a little bit earlier, just talking about helping people to make the connections between practices of the church and theology and everyday life. So you have this wonderful way in your last book, Liturgy of the Ordinary, and then now also in this one, this wonderful way of helping make connections between worship practices, like actual worship practices of the church. And then in your case, you're pulling especially upon Anglican church liturgy, and helping make connections between those practices in everyday life and how we live out our faith in the particulars of each day. So I'm just wondering if you could share with us, how did you start coming to make those connections between worship practices, public worship practices, and then everyday life? And also, what has been some of the response from your readers to that way of making those connections?
Sorry, turning off my phone. Yeah, I think I honestly started doing this in my own life. In other words, I didn't sit down at any point in Liturgy of the Ordinary or this book and say, okay, so what are the practices that what can I kind of drum up to talk about that fits this? It didn't start there. Anyway, it started, I was an Anglican, started going to an Anglican church that was still, so I began writing Liturgy of the Ordinary, I guess in 2014, something like that. So at that point, I would have been an Anglican about 7 years. And I was in the ordination process. I don't think I was finished with the ordination process yet. So I was towards the end of it. So all that to say, it was still fairly new. And so I think I didn't grow up Anglican. I didn't grow up with any, the church that I went to would have explicitly thought of itself as non-liturgical. I actually think all churches have liturgies, but they would have found themselves kind of in reaction to that, right? And so I didn't know what, I'd never heard of the church calendar until I was an adult. I mean, in college. So I was discovering these things as a 20-something and just taken by it, and it was infecting and affecting my imagination. And so it was, these connections were being made in my ordinary life, right? When I was making meals and making connections between the Eucharist and the meal I was making, when I was practicing the liturgical calendar and sort of thinking about that in my ordinary life, or when I was giving my children baths and thinking about baptism, right? Because I'm like it's a very similar, I've done both. I've baptized people, I've given kids baths, and it's a similar physical movement, right? Of pouring water on someone's head. And so these kind of imaginative, symbolic, metaphorical connections were happening in my daily life. They were happening all the time. And so I was thinking a lot and writing some and about the ways that Christian worship, particularly Anglican worship, intersects with really quiet, ordinary moments. And I had taken a poetry class in 2011. A lot, looking back, those poems have been seen by no one but me and my professor. But looking back, a lot of this was in there. A lot of these sorts of connections were already being made because they were just happening in my brain. They were happening in my imagination. And the same thing with Prayer in the Night. I didn't say, man, I want to write a book about theodicy and suffering and practices. What practices should I use? It was like, I lived this experience where the prayers and practices of the church were what carried me. And then I wrote about those things. So a lot of it is experiencing these things in my own life, then informing my own imagination, and then writing out of that place. So I think that it's more just sort of this is the stuff I do. That's what practices are. But I use the word practices a lot. It sounds very highfalutin, but it's really stuff we do, right? It's so Christian spirituality is the stuff Christians do, and so when I'm doing this stuff, it informs how I see the world, and it informs how I write about the world. But it was a little more than that. I'm making it like there was a little bit more intentionality in that I was making these connections and thought, oh, I want to share these with other people. And so Liturgy of the Ordinary actually started where I said, I just wish that I could bring everyone into my house and we could just go through the most boring day together and then just push pause and go, wait, like how are we being formed right now? What is the assumptions we're taking into this moment? What are the ways God's at work in this moment? What way does doctrine inform this moment? What way does practice inform? And being that I couldn't bring 150,000 people in my house, I wrote this book instead.
Well, and it's obviously a very deeply ingrained way of looking at the world for you, because you tell this story in the prologue of Prayer in the Night, where it's an incredibly painful and dramatic story of having to go to the emergency room when you're experiencing a miscarriage and you're losing this blood, and you call out to your husband in that moment, I want to pray Compline. And you say specifically in the prologue that you felt like in that moment you needed to pray Compline just as much as you needed the blood transfusion from the nurses. that they were giving you in that moment. So could you explain, well, first off, maybe a little bit about what Compline is for any viewers who may not know may not be familiar with that tradition, but then also, why did you feel like you needed it so much, just as much as that blood transfusion in that moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the situation was I was in the emergency room. I was hemorrhaging. It was very intense. My husband thought I was going to die. I wasn't actually close to dying, but it was scary. I mean, it was visually frightening because I was losing a lot of blood. And I don't entirely understand, but I knew it was somewhat, I don't know if compulsive is the right word, but I don't feel like I had loads of choice in the matter. I needed to pray. And I had no idea. I knew I needed to pray. I had no idea how to pray. And this was the lifeline. I mean, this was sort of, I needed to pray and I couldn't, and this was the way I could. And so, the reason that is, like, backing up, so that's the start, backing up. I had, there's this practice of nighttime prayers, which is Compline or Compline. You can pronounce it either way. Don't feel bad. I say Compline. I'm going to say Compline, and then everyone apologizes. But it really is, as many people say, it's an alternative pronunciation.
You're being maybe a little bit nice to me for my...
No, lots of people do that. So it's fine to say it either way. But these prayers had been for a while, for really over years. I'd kind of done them on and off, and especially during our time of moving and when my father passed away, they became really important to me. And in particular, so at this point, I'd probably been doing them fairly consistently for several years. So these words were sort of in me, as part of it, but also the reason I was drawn to these, I think in particular, is that they're a prayer that really recognizes vulnerability and that things are broken in the world. So there was, in the middle of this time of kind of suffering and sorrow, I tried to listen to this kind of podcast of devotions from a pastor who I will not mention, but it was so upbeat and it was so peppy and it was so like, Jesus has got this, and it just felt like, it made it more difficult for me to believe because it seemed disconnected from the reality of my daily life and experience. But something about Compline really acknowledged, I mean, you pray about things like the perils and dangers of this night. You pray, be our light in the darkness. You pray about death. I mean, it talks about, you pray for the dying, but also words like, you repeat throughout Compline that we may, it says, that we may rest in peace over and over again. This rest in peace, right? That we use, people tweet it when celebrities die, right? Like, this is a common trope, and you say it again and again, that awake we may watch with Christ, that asleep we may rest in peace. And so there's this interplay between death and sleep that's all the way through Compline. And because of that, there's kind of an emotional, I think different Christian practices take on sort of different emotional tenors. And I think that this has an emotional weight of kind of human vulnerability, of sorrow, of grief, of mortality, of darkness. And yet in the middle of that, it calls on Jesus as the light. It calls for the presence of God. And I needed something that really didn't pull punches about how scary things can be in the world, but also called on God in the middle of that. And I had too many questions, and the reality of the situation, the moment I was in, was big. I mean, we had to we had to leave our children with basics. They were near strangers at the time, and rush to the hospital. And so it was this intense moment, and I didn't have um, the strength, even the physical strength, to really pray. And so what I sort of drew from in that moment was this really embedded practice of prayer that had become part of my life. And not, I mean, I wasn't even, it's not that I even do Compline every day. It's that I did it enough that in that moment I could sort of reach for it. And so why exactly did I did that and just know it was like, I absolutely knew that's what I needed. I don't know. I certainly at the time had no thought that it would end up in a book. So I didn't really think through why I needed that so much. But I think it was that what was happening to me was physical, but it wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. I was losing a child and I was in danger. And it was about a month after my father had gone to the emergency room and died there. Like it never left. And so all of this was kind of ricocheting through me. And I just knew that I needed words of truth to carry me. And that came to me through, I needed words from the church. I talk about it in the book as other people's prayers. And in that moment, I needed that. And so we prayed Compline right there with the nurses in the emergency room while I was bleeding. And yeah. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And if I'm getting the story right, that was at night.
It was at night. That's right. That was good reading. Yes, it was. It was in the middle of the night. But when I first started, it was kind of dinner time. But by the time we made it to the hospital and I was checked in, at that point I was waiting for surgery, and it was late then. So yeah, so it was the middle of the night.
Yeah, well, and that to me, sort of almost then just adds this extra dimension of, so the Compline prayer. I'm switching over to Compline because I was years ago plugged into communities who would have pronounced it like that, but I forgot it by now. I haven't heard it.
Okay. Either way, you be you.
The Compline prayer, by definition, it happens in darkness because it's
yeah. Yeah, that's true. It would have been, that's true. I think this is actually part of why I wanted to pray it. And this is helpful that you pointed this out, is that would have been, I had not prayed Compline yet that day. And so that would have been the office of the hour that I was in. It was the end of the day and it was time to pray Compline. And so there was almost Pavlovian, kind of the sun has set, and these are the prayers we pray now.
Yeah.
But they had sort of extra weight, when you're praying for the sick and the dying, and you're in an emergency room and you're sick. There's a reality to those words, I think.
Right. And then it leads in your book to even further reflections on darkness in general. So what does it mean to be walking through dark times? And what does it mean to face the darkness? And you talk even about facing the literal darkness, which there's been times in your life that has brought about fear. And I'm sure you're not the only one. I experienced that myself. So I wonder if you could just expand a little bit about how Compline can help us understand darkness, and how maybe also how has your own experience or understanding of darkness been changed by praying and meditating on the words of Compline?
Yeah. Yeah, so I do. I sort of start with physical darkness and go into talking about, and there's a long history in the church of talking about darkness, night, the darkness of night as a symbol of evil, of uncertainty. Of course, I brought up Saint John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul. And I say in the book, like, there's a reason he used that metaphor, right? And there's a reason he talked about obscurus, is the idea of that we can't see and we don't know. I mean, it was, there's a reason he didn't say, you know, the tough morning of the soul. That there's something about night that resonates really. And as I was doing research for this book, it's really across culture. Almost every single culture in the world has some sense of trepidation or spirit stories, or night as this kind of place that has a lot of spiritual meaning, I think, to people. And I really do think this is one of those places where it's hard to see where metaphor ends and physical or scientific reality begins. They're really fused in that that every day we experience darkness, and it is this kind of visceral reminder from nature and in our bodies that that we are weak, that we are in need of light, that we are in need of guidance, that we are vulnerable. Even friends of mine who love night, and I want to acknowledge that, because there's some folks on this webinar who are like, night is my favorite time of day, which is true. But part of that generally is because we have access to some sort of light in that, even if it's a candle, that it's the light, it's the stars, it's the moon that make, otherwise the darkness becomes, if the darkness gets too deep, it's really unbearable, because it brings up such a visceral sense of vulnerability, of not being able to see or navigate. And so because of that, we have all these spiritual metaphors, which are very scriptural, of course, right? Like it comes to that Jesus is the light whom darkness could not overcome. This is all very much metaphors from scripture. But you see it in these prayers and in even the history of the church, in the way that we talk about doubt, we talk about struggle with sin as encounters with darkness, or as dark nights of the soul. We talk about Jesus as the light of the world, right? That's from scripture. But it's also because we resonate with that, because we have such an actual dependence on light, on we're just creatures that need light. Even and of course, ultimately in scripture, the culmination of this is in Revelation, where night is no more. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is the light in the center of the city. And so now, is there like literally no nighttime anymore? I mean, possibly, but that's also what that's saying is primarily, it's a metaphorical way of saying there is no more sin, there is no more suffering, there's nothing hidden, there's nothing more to fear. That so the way that light and mortality, the power of sin, the power of death, or rather I would say darkness and the power of sin and mortality are sort of, they kind of interplay, is all throughout scripture, all throughout tradition, and also in almost every single culture in the world. And so you see these all throughout, and it really, I think, informs Compline. I mean, we pray again and again to Jesus as our light, right? That's a common, and that's really common. And so and I think this, for me, this was sort of weaving together the metaphor of this, of darkness and light, with our actual embodied experience of darkness and light. But I think those, it's such a potent metaphor that our visceral experience, I think, reflects something really true about reality. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Like, we feel vulnerable because we really are vulnerable. We feel like we need a protector because we really do need a protector. Children, they've done studies under the age of 2 even have night terrors that are almost primordial. Like they're from the depths of the human experience. During COVID, it was really interesting. Studies came out that people had a particular difficult time at night, and that manifests itself in all kind of having bad nightmares and that sort of thing. So I think that our experience of human vulnerability is often put in terms of darkness and light. And I think that's because it's touching on something really true and ultimate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could we stay there for a little bit on just on the theme of vulnerability? So there's an entire section of the book with 3 or 4 chapters that's devoted to this theme of vulnerability. And it seems to me, at least in my own reading of it, that you're talking about something that's a little bit more comprehensive or broad than somebody like Brene Brown when she talks about vulnerability. And I love Brene Brown and her approach and all that she does with those themes of shame and vulnerability. But when you're talking about vulnerability, and you're again being prompted by these prayers from the Compline prayer service, you're calling attention to the wider facts of that our bodies are weak, that we need sleep, that we get sick, that we get wearied and weighed down, that we all will die. And and that seems to me so much more comprehensive and almost just basic and fundamental when you're talking about how we approach the theme of vulnerability as humans, as Christian believers. So I'm wondering, in what ways do you think your own, I guess, meditations on vulnerability prompted by Compline could maybe shift or maybe deepen the cultural conversation that we have around vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in one little footnote in the book, it's actually you'd have to go read the end notes. They're not footnotes, they're end notes. So in one end note of the book, I kind of say how what I'm doing is different than Brene Brown, or the way I talk about vulnerability is different than Brene Brown. I think that they're overlapping. So I don't think I don't think anything that I say about vulnerability is in conflict with anything Brene Brown has said. And yeah, so, and from what I've heard, she likes the book. So I think, but I do think they're I think the way that we're talking about vulnerability is slightly different. In that I talk about vulnerability as this sort of unchosen reality for all of us, that from the root word vulner, wound, is able to be wounded, right? And all of us are able to be wounded, and emotionally and spiritually and physically. She talks about vulnerability that way too, but she also talks about it as kind of a choice, like an emotional, like the choice to be vulnerable or to not to be vulnerable, that one could choose not to be vulnerable by kind of being emotionally open and exposed, or kind of emotionally warm or closed off, right? And so in that use of vulnerability, kind of like your therapist may be very vulnerable, and John Wayne would not be, right? But the way I'm talking about vulnerability, I'm saying John Wayne is deeply vulnerable, right? John Wayne died, and so he's very, very vulnerable. So that it's this fact of existence that humans are vulnerable, and we can't get out of that, and we all know it. We all know it on some level, whether we pay attention to that reality or not. We all know we will die and the people that we love will die. And so when I'm talking about vulnerability, and I have the second part of my book is called The Way of the Vulnerable, and the third part of my book is called A Taxonomy of Vulnerability. We're sort of looking at specific types of vulnerability. I mean simply that we are actually fragile, and that we are maybe frail is a better word than fragile, because we're very strong also, but we're also all very frail, and we're also all very vulnerable. We're all very able to be wounded. And so in that sense, what I think is important about talking about it that way is that we can't therefore opt a group out. There's not certain people that are not vulnerable. Now, I bring this up in the book. That doesn't mean everyone is equally suffers or is equally vulnerable. Obviously, there are people in our society, because of injustice or because of lack of privilege or because of disability, that are, or even physical weakness, that are more vulnerable. Children are more vulnerable in ways than adults. They are more easily wounded. But that doesn't make adults not vulnerable, right? And so I do think there's a shared commonality to humans in this, that we need to tap into, because part of where we meet one another as people trying to love our neighbors is that every single person that you encounter, no matter how much of a front they're trying to put on, is deeply, deeply vulnerable and is able to be wounded and likely has been wounded. And so I think that is important in terms of ethics, in terms of loving our neighbor. It's also important theologically, because it starts us in a place of that we're dependent, that we're needy for protection, that we're needy for love, that we're needy for care, or as I say in the book, like someone to guard the door, right, while we're sleeping. So I think it's an important point because it's a true point. And I just don't think that, I think it's part of the condition of being a creature that none of us can opt out of. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing wrong with the way Brene Brown uses it as emotional exposure. That's within the lexical meaning of the word. That's part of what vulnerability means. You can say, oh, she was really vulnerable in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm actually focusing on a different part of the meaning, which is that this is just reality. Yeah. At every moment of our lives, we're vulnerable, whether you want to be or not, whether you feel like it or not, whether you're trying to act really tough or not. Like it's a facade.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a note to our live viewers who are with us, the Q&A box is available, and we'll try to have some time at the end if you have any questions for Tish that you would like her to address, and we'll hope to get to a few questions if you want to type them in the Q&A box. But I've got another question for you now, and it's about this idea of lament. You say in the book that we need to learn how to weep, that we need to become a lamenting culture to learn how to take time for grief. And sometimes when I hear that word, at least the idea of lament seems to be a lot more common nowadays than I remember it being, maybe even 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like to me in some ways that the idea of lament is gaining traction in the church in America, where it may have been very weak and not a cultural value for a long time. And then at other times, there are these reminders that we have just this strong cultural push against these calls for learning how to lament. And so I know it can be dangerous sometimes to speak in very sort of anecdotal generalities, but I just wonder, what are your own impressions about American culture, maybe the dominant culture, white culture in America especially, and learning how to lament.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think here's what I think. I think that there's a long established practice, stuff we do, of sort of glossing over lament, or particularly in white culture, right? I'm not talking about African American spirituals right now, or the blues or something, but funerals are often these very sort of buttoned up affairs. We're very proper, right? And there's not a lot of demonstrative experiences of grief, and in our worship, evangelical worship has historically been very like, look on the bright side, in with the positive, and so there's it's not an intentional denial of darkness, but I think that folks are so eager to focus on the resurrection that we miss Good Friday, right? They're so eager to focus on redemption, which is true, that you miss the darkness, the fall, the brokenness that we're being redeemed from. It's a matter of emphasis, but the problem is if you end up, however, inadvertently ignoring or belittling the fall, the power of darkness, the power of death, the cross, you always end up inadvertently belittling the resurrection and the power of redemption. So I do think kind of culturally there is a deep tendency. I talk in the book about some of the very first words written in the English language on our shores were from a Puritan poet who lost a child to a stillborn child, and she wrote, "There is no time for grief. There is no time. There is only time for labor in the cold." And I think these were some of the first English words written here. I think this is just such a shape of our culture. If we just keep moving forward, infinite sort of optimism, positivity about the future. This is like part of what made America, right? But because of that, there's not time for grief. And we see this in all. I could talk about this for hours of the way we've now all. Many of our new cemeteries are outside of town, right? Like we used to have our churches all surrounded by gravestones, but that doesn't happen anymore. We don't want to have to walk through the dead on our way to church, right? And so, but because of these shifts, the church itself spends a lot of time denying mortality and denying the power of darkness, and not talking about how we're grieving, or talking about it, but always ending with but God's in control, or but in kind of a pat answer to. I mean, I really do believe God's in control, but it's but if we use as a reviewer of my book said that the book showed him how he uses theology to cork his grief, which I just thought was such a lovely phrase, that we can use theology to cork this, to sort of deny the power of grief in our life. So I think that's our cultural tendency. I also do think, I agree with you, that there's been, I'd say particularly the last 5 years, there's been a resurgent interest in grief. People often quote that part of my book online. They want to talk about that. So that, and I'd be curious to see if this is a generational thing or not. I actually don't know. That's a study someone can do at your your center. But to see, I do feel like there's I see in younger generations this like deep desire for spaces of lament, for places where you just name the brokenness in the world without trying to tie it all up in a bow at the end. we've had services of lament in our church, and people were very grateful for them. We're wanting them. So it's just both. I think there is kind of a new interest in lament, and I see this all around books on it, but also think, I mean, the way people have responded to my book. Doug McKelvey with the Rabbit Room has a book of prayers out that are specifically focused on death and mortality and grief, and that just came out this year. So I think there is a new pull towards this. The Anna Porter's Gate, the worship collective, just had lament songs that they specifically made because they felt like there weren't enough worship songs about lament. And so you're seeing a movement towards this. But I think the movement is coming in reaction to probably a long time where worship songs in particular were very focused on the sort of peppy and positive and anthemic kind of musical tones, and not kind of the more the more minor key of the Christian life. And again, that's one of those metaphors that it's hard to know where the metaphor, but like the reality, I'm talking about minor keys, but also that our life holds these minor keys too that have to be heard.
Yeah. Well, this theme of lament especially seems to have also struck a chord with our viewers. I got several questions that have come in wanting to follow up a little bit about that. And I'm going to take a liberty here and maybe combine a couple of the questions and see if there might be related. One person is asking if you could talk about the difference between, like, sometimes people criticize themselves for wallowing in their sorrow or in their sadness, feeling like they shouldn't be wallowing in this, and that they should focus instead on the positive things. But so can you talk about the difference between what it means to wallow and not be able to get out of this space of grief and sadness, or how that is distinct from lamenting? And then also, if I can just kind of tack on the further question of what that might look like in public worship. What does lament look like, feel like in a service of public worship?
Yeah. Okay. I think, okay, so about the wallowing piece first. I have a lot to say about that. First of all, so I don't know. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think first, this is partly why we really, really do need community, and we need things like spiritual directors, and we need people that know us well, that one man's wallowing is another man's healing, really is coming to terms with what's happening. So I think some of this is we need spiritual guides that know us well and that can sort of walk with us in this, to know when we are nursing grief in an unhealthy or self-pitying kind of way, and to know when we're really lamenting, and so that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that in my book I talk about working, watching, and weeping, partly because the prayer that the book is, the book is entirely focused on one prayer of Compline, and I use that one prayer to get at all these other questions. So it's not really about that prayer, but the prayer is a framing device for these larger questions in the book. I mean, I guess it really is about that prayer, but it's about more than that prayer. And that prayer says, keep watch, this, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night. So I use work, watch, weep as kind of the posture of response that we have to the grief in all of our lives. And I mean suffering, big suffering, loss of life, but I mean small griefs too, like little places of grief, ordinary places of grief. But I talk about holding those together because I start with weeping, lament, and we move to watching, which means having our eyes really open to where God is at work in the world. And then working is joining God in that work of redemption, pushing back the darkness, seeking justice, seeking beauty, seeking truth, right? Seeking to have works of compassion that alleviate other people's suffering. And so, but even in our work, we won't accomplish it. We're not going to bring the full kingdom. Our work is complicit even in evil, and it drives us back into working. And so, I mean, into weeping and watching and working. And so I talk in the book about how we really have to hold all three of these together. So if we just end up with weeping, but we no longer are looking, we don't have eyes to watch for the coming of Jesus, I mean that like I mean that in terms of eschatologically, the actual coming of Jesus, but also the coming of Jesus in our day and in our life, these moments of grace that break through, the moments of light in the darkness. If we close our eyes to that, we could just end up in despair, right? Or inaction. We could just sort of lament all day and not be moved to actually seek to bring about change, right? It could just end up in this kind of passive thoughts and prayers sort of way where we don't actually work for change in the world. But if we go straight to work and we're going to fix this and we're getting on top of this, then I actually think not only do we miss the deep spiritual formation that comes in weeping, but that we will inevitably go to work in a way that is compulsive, that is idolatrous, that's trying to tamp down and deny our own weakness and vulnerability. So somewhat, I would say this question by the book. Sorry, but read about watching, working, and weeping, because they go all together. And I think if we try to tease them apart, it gets wonky. It's this three-legged stool that's kind of needed together. Now, that said, I will say, I think, because I do think that our culture has historically had a tendency to minimize grief, I think a lot of us, in trying to not wallow in it, end up really not facing our grief, and it ends up coming out in other ways. So if you don't lament, the sorrow doesn't actually go away. It's still there. It's just going to come out as uncontrolled anger, as addiction, as in all kinds of unhealthy ways. And you see this so much in the culture, and you see this so much in the church. And so I think that well, okay. So one of the things I was going to say earlier, without getting too much into it, but the response to COVID's been really interesting, because I would have certainly said that as a culture, we're more interested in laments. But in this really, really hard year, I've been surprised how little lament I've seen, both from a public, like we never had a national day of mourning, but also even kind of the church really split on this. And there wasn't a lot of overt, just sort of lamenting the brokenness in the world. We are not meant to live in a world where we face a global pandemic. And what I saw, so because we weren't lamenting, we really went to outrage. And so there was an enormous amount of anger on both sides of the aisle in our country. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for this, and this is not the only reason. This is not like a sort of one-size-fits-all ideology, but I think part of the explosive anger that you've seen in our country in the last year is that global pandemics are really things to grieve, and people would not lament. And so they went to solutions, they went to denial, they went to all kinds of things. And we didn't lament. And so I think in general, it's not good for folks to wallow in things, but I think that I've been surprised how little lament I've seen. And people aren't saying I refuse lament, but what they're going to is anger. What they're going to is blame. What they're going to is false information and denial. And so what I'm saying is when you're seeing people, quote unquote, not wallowing in it, often that comes out in a way that's not always healthy. So the last bit I'll say here is that we have to hold lament and gratitude together. That gratitude is also a super important practice in the Christian life that we hold together with lament, and we just hold them both at the same time. It's not that we have times of lament and times of gratitude. They're just kind of always there at all moments of our life. And so the church has to make space for that. We have to ask people, what are you mourning? What are you and we also need to have, what are you grateful for? And these are questions we could be asking each other in small groups and that sort of thing, where we're talking about both together. Okay, then the very last thing you said about what this looks like in a church community, to hold both of these, to hold gratitude and mourning, there's a lot of different ways this can be done, through music, through preaching. One thing I'll highlight is that the church calendar is very helpful with this, because they have times of like Advent, where you really are called to look at the darkness, to lament, to reflect, to see how things are fallen, to see how really, really we need a manual to ransom captive Israel. We relive and remember our captivity. And then comes Christmas. And I really do think it's easy, I think, for folks who love lament to be like, oh, this is all about lament. But in those celebration times, people like me that tend to be melancholy, or that tend to not want to celebrate, or that think celebration is somehow less real or less gritty or less true, need to be told, like, no, pour a glass of champagne, and you have so much, like, the light has come, the king has come, it is time to rejoice. And so one of the things I like about the church calendar is it calls those who tend to be to really want to deny darkness to look at the darkness. But then we have 50 full days of Easter, and it's hard for us. We're not, as Andy Crouch said it, we are not used to sustained joy. And so joy and gratitude and celebrating resurrection, that's also a practice in the church calendar that has to be intentionally embraced. And so I think we need everyone to be uncomfortable at some point in the year. The things that you're sort of called into.
Yeah. That's, well, and that's a good answer to the question too. Sometimes it comes up, the idea of, well, weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. But how do you do that when sort of you're always every Sunday going to have both in your congregations, both people who are weeping and rejoicing? And I like what you've said there about at least the structure of the church here is one way that we can practice a sort of intentionality and a seasonality to how those things get worked through our public worship practices. I would love to keep talking. There's been great questions that have come in also, just even about songs of lament and what you would recommend, and how this relates to preaching and evangelism and that kind of thing. We're not going to be able to get to those, all of those, but I want to give you a chance to have a final word of, you in your book, you end on pointing in a hopeful direction. You have these two chapters meditating on joy and love. And so I'm thinking especially of those who might be joining us today who are right now in the midst of times of grief or suffering or affliction. And what words of hope would you share with those who are in those times to conclude our time together?
So, I mean, what I came to, this book was written out of my own struggle with theodicy, the idea of how can God be good and powerful and bad things still happen in the world. And I would say that I don't think that there's an answer that's going to be satisfying, inside or outside the church. Honestly, I don't think there's some kind of pat reason that can be given for sorrow that will make it okay, or that will make it reasonable to us. I think by nature it is what we're wanting in our struggle with that question of theodicy is not an answer, it's action on the part of God. And so ultimately I think it's rooted in a deep, deep longing. I've more and more, I think that longing is just the posture that we live the Christian life in, that we are longing for God to set things right. We're longing for shalom to be restored. And so how do we endure that longing? That's what the whole book is about. And I don't have kind of an easy answer. It took me 2 years and writing 80,000 words and whittling them down. But I do think that ultimately what we want to know is what God is like, and if this God, whoever he, she, or it is, loves us. And I think that these questions of how can we continue to know God, how can this be true in the midst of darkness, comes down to those questions. And I believe that those questions are decisively answered in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That ultimately we don't have an answer to the problem of evil. We have a story, a true story in history of God revealing himself to the world. And so there's not going to be enough evidence of God's goodness or lack thereof in the world. I talk in the book about how like the evidence is inconclusive. We could sort of name all the beautiful things in the world and all the dark things, and it's unclear. And so I tell the story about my friend Julie, whose son went into surgery, and she said, as he's being wheeled back, she said, we have to decide whether or not God is good before we know the results of the surgery. Because if I wait and that answer depends on the results of the surgery, I will always keep God on trial. So I talk in the book about how do we make that decision? Is it a leap in the dark? Is it just an arbitrary what we hope for? And I think ultimately that we make that decision by looking at who Jesus is. I think the resurrection, whether or not the resurrection is true, is the ultimate answer to theodicy. If Jesus is risen, if he sees us and loves us, then I think I can keep walking in this way. And so ultimately, my hope is in that I say this at the end of the book, that every single week we say, Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. That's not an answer to theodicy, but it's an honest assessment of it, that Christ died, there is death and brokenness, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. That's ultimately, I think, that's the hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that word of hope to conclude our time. Thank you to everyone who joined us live, and thank you especially to you, Tish, for spending this time with us. We are very grateful.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I wish we could have gotten to more questions. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll have to save that for another time. I guess that's the teaser for.
Okay, well, let's get together again.
All right, sounds good. Thank you all, and God bless. Goodbye.